The champagne bubbles caught the December twilight like tiny diamonds dancing in crystal, but none sparkled as brilliantly as the emerald necklace resting against Taraji Luthen Hemsworth's dark skin as she surveyed the glittering crowd of Manhattan's elite celebrating her 5th wedding anniversary. At 42, Taraji possessed the kind of timeless elegance that made younger women study her secrets and older women nod in approval. Her natural hair was styled in an elaborate updo that showcased both the vintage Cartier emeralds Wesley had surprised her with that morning and the graceful curve of her neck. 5 years to the day since their December wedding, their anniversary celebration was everything Manhattan society expected. The custom golden silk gown she wore, one of her own designs from Lathan Luxury's latest collection, hugged her curves like liquid sunshine, flowing into a dramatic train that whispered across the marble floors of their penthouse with each step. 5 years of what everyone believes is perfection, she murmured to herself, watching her husband command the room with the effortless authority that had built Hemsworth Industries into a global empire. Wesley Hemsworth, at 45, was devastatingly handsome in the way that only came with age, power, and the kind of bone-deep confidence that made Fortune 500 CEOs defer to his judgment. His dark hair showed distinguished silver at the temples, and those striking green eyes that had first captured her heart 8 years ago still made her pulse quicken when they found hers across a crowded room. 300 guests filled their penthouse, senators, celebrities, tech moguls, fashion royalty, and old money aristocrats who rarely deigned to attend anyone's private celebrations. But this wasn't just anyone's party. This was the 5th anniversary of the most talked-about power couple in Manhattan, and everyone who mattered had moved mountains to be here. Ladies and gentlemen, Wesley's rich baritone cut through the elegant chatter like warm honey, causing conversations to fade into expectant silence. He stood on the raised platform near the floor-to-ceiling windows, the glittering Manhattan skyline serving as his backdrop, looking every inch the billionaire king in his custom Tom Ford tuxedo. Taraji felt her heart flutter exactly as it had 8 years ago when he'd first spoken to her at the Metropolitan Museum's charity gala, though now she understood that flutter differently than she had then. Some things never changed, including the way this man could make any woman feel like the only person in the world, even when she knew better. 5 years ago tonight, I married the most extraordinary woman in Manhattan, Wesley continued, his voice carrying effortlessly across the room. But our story began 8 years ago when I thought I understood what success meant. I had built a technology empire, accumulated wealth that exceeded most nations' GDP, owned properties on every continent worth visiting. He paused, his piercing green eyes scanning the crowd before settling on Taraji with an intensity that sent familiar heat coursing through her veins. The guests seemed to hold their collective breath, sensing they were witnessing something intimate and profound. But I was a man living in a golden cage until this extraordinary woman walked into my life 8 years ago and taught me what true wealth actually looked like. He extended his hand toward her, and she felt every gaze in the room turn her way with the weight of expectation and envy. Taraji moved through the crowd with the fluid grace that had once graced runways before she discovered her true calling lay in creating beauty rather than merely displaying it. Wesley met her halfway, taking her hands in his with the reverence of a man handling priceless art. Taraji didn't just transform my cold penthouse with her revolutionary design vision, he said, his voice dropping to a more intimate register that somehow still carried to every corner of the room. She transformed my very soul. She took a calculating businessman who had forgotten how to feel and taught him how to love without reservation, without fear, without limits. The sincerity in his voice was so complete that several women in the audience visibly melted, their expressions softening with romantic longing. Even the cynical society photographers seemed momentarily enchanted. their cameras capturing every nuance of the couple's obvious devotion. "You turned my world from black and white into technicolor," Wesley whispered, loud enough for the nearby guests to hear, but intimate enough to feel like a private confession. "You are my heart, my inspiration, my queen." When his lips claimed hers, the kiss was passionate enough to make the society photographer's cameras flash frantically, yet tender enough to bring actual tears to the eyes of the romantic souls in attendance. Taraji melted into him, playing her role perfectly, while her mind calculated every detail of the performance they were both delivering. The applause was thunderous, but Taraji barely heard it through the rushing sound of her own pulse. This man, this moment, this life they had built together. To everyone watching, it was everything anyone could ever dream of during those lean years when ambition was all you had to sustain you. "Get a room, you two," called out a familiar voice from the crowd, earning delighted laughter from the guests. Taraji turned to see Mirellen Cross approaching with a champagne flute in each hand and her trademark mischievous grin. At 38, Mirellen was Taraji's opposite in many ways: petite, where Taraji was statuesque; auburn-haired, where Taraji was raven black; spontaneous, where Taraji was methodical. But they shared the same fierce ambition and unshakable loyalty that had built Lathan Luxury from a pipe dream into an $800 million fashion empire. "Don't be jealous just because your love life consists of Netflix and premium ice cream," Taraji shot back, accepting one of the champagne flutes with a grin. It was their usual banter, polished from years of friendship and business partnership. "Hey, Ben and Jerry never let me down," Mirellen retorted. "Can't say the same about the male population of Manhattan." As the laughter died down and conversations resumed around them, Taraji found herself reflecting on the incredible journey that had brought her to this moment. 8 years ago, she had been designing wedding dresses in a cramped studio above a Korean restaurant in Queens, working 18-hour days just to keep the lights on and the creditors at bay. Then had come that life-changing night at the Met's Spring Gala, where she had donated several of her revolutionary fabric designs for the charity auction, hoping for exposure that might lead to her first real break. "Excuse me, but are you the designer behind these incredible textile innovations?" She had turned to find the most striking man she had ever seen standing behind her, studying the fabric installations with what seemed like genuine fascination. Wesley Hemsworth, whose recent divorce from socialite heiress Cassandra Whitmore had dominated tabloid headlines for months, but who was known in business circles as a visionary with the Midas touch. "Guilty as charged," she had replied, surprised by his obvious knowledge of textile engineering. Most wealthy patrons at these events treated designers like invisible service providers. "They're revolutionary. The way you've engineered the fibers to interact with light while maintaining structural integrity. It's like wearing liquid starlight," he had said, his green eyes holding hers with startling intensity. "I'm renovating my penthouse, and I've been searching for someone who understands that true luxury isn't about displaying wealth. It's about creating beauty that speaks directly to the soul." Now, 5 years into their marriage, she understood that conversation differently. Wesley had done his research, had known exactly what to say to capture her attention and her trust. But that knowledge didn't diminish the fact that what had followed had been the most lucrative design contract of her career, transforming his sterile bachelor pad into a warm, sophisticated sanctuary that had been featured on the covers of Architectural Digest, Elle Decor, and House Beautiful. Wesley had invested $50 million in Lathan Luxury in 2019, 1 year after they met and 1 year before their engagement, becoming her silent partner and enabling her to expand internationally. Their wedding 5 years ago had been a fairy tale worthy of royalty, a destination ceremony at a restored Tuscan villa with 400 guests, exclusive coverage in Vogue and Harper's Bazaar, and a month-long honeymoon in Bali that had felt like a beautiful dream. Mrs. Hemsworth, a server, appeared at her elbow with a silver tray. "Mr. Hemsworth asked me to give you this." Taraji accepted the small velvet box with curiosity, opening it to reveal a stunning pair of diamond earrings that perfectly complemented her emerald necklace. The card tucked inside read, "For the woman who makes every day feel like our wedding day, forever yours, W.A." "That man is disgustingly romantic," Mirellen observed, peering over her shoulder. "It's actually offensive how perfect you two appear to be together." Appear to be. Mirellen's choice of words was more accurate than she knew. As if summoned by their conversation, Wesley appeared beside them, sliding his arm around Taraji's waist with the possessive pride of a man who knew exactly how valuable his acquisition had become. "Are you ladies conspiring against me?" he asked, pressing a kiss to Taraji's temple. "Always," Mirellen replied cheerfully. "It's what best friends do." "Good thing I'm irresistible then," Wesley said with the kind of confident charm that should have been obnoxious but somehow managed to be endearing. "Your humility is truly inspiring," Taraji said dryly, earning another round of laughter. As the evening continued, Taraji moved through the party in a golden haze of performance. This was her life now, sophistication, success, and a love story that made other women sigh with envy. She had everything she had ever wanted, and tomorrow would bring even more possibilities. What none of the guests could have known was that exactly 7¾ years ago, just 2 months after Wesley had first approached her at the Met Gala, he had reconnected with his college girlfriend and begun an affair that would produce a daughter. A daughter who would soon make an innocent comment that would expose the truth about the man everyone believed to be Manhattan's most devoted husband. If only the distinguished guests raising champagne toasts to eternal love had known that by this time tomorrow their perfect power couple would be at the center of the most spectacular scandal in Manhattan's social history, and that one of them had been planning for this moment far longer than anyone could have imagined. Chapter 2. Silk Threads and Hidden Thorns. The morning light streaming through the penthouse's floor-to-ceiling windows turned everything into liquid gold, but nothing glowed quite as beautifully as Taraji's skin as she stood in their gourmet kitchen, wearing nothing but Wesley's crisp white dress shirt from the night before. She moved with unconscious grace as she prepared his favorite breakfast: steel-cut oats with fresh blueberries from their private rooftop garden, artisanal honey from a farm in Vermont, and Ethiopian coffee that cost more per pound than most people's weekly grocery budget. After 5 years of marriage, she had memorized every detail of his morning routine, from how he liked his coffee, black, no sugar, served at exactly 165 degrees, to the way he preferred his newspapers arranged: Wall Street Journal first, Financial Times second, New York Times Business section third. "Good morning, beautiful," Wesley's voice rumbled behind her as strong arms encircled her waist. Even after 5 years, his touch still sent electricity racing through her nervous system, though now she understood that her body's response and her mind's calculations operated on entirely different frequencies. He nuzzled her neck, his morning stubble rough against her smooth skin, his breath warm and intimate. "Last night was perfect. You were perfect." She murmured, leaning back against his solid chest, inhaling his distinctive scent: sandalwood, bergamot, and something indefinably masculine that belonged only to him. The guests certainly seemed to enjoy themselves. "They always do when they're witnessing something real," Wesley said, and Taraji had to admire his ability to deliver lies with such complete conviction. She turned in his arms, struck again by how devastatingly handsome he was in the morning light. Silver-threaded hair slightly mussed from sleep, those mesmerizing green eyes still heavy with drowsiness, wearing nothing but black silk pajama pants that rode low on his lean hips. At 45, He maintained the physique of a man 20 years younger through religious adherence to his personal trainer and a diet that would make a monk weep with envy. "I love you," she said simply, the words carrying the exact weight of truth that the moment required. "And I love you," he replied, though something flickered across his features. Too quick for most people to identify, but Taraji had learned to read his micro-expressions like stock market fluctuations. More than you could possibly know. The irony was that she knew exactly how much he loved her, precisely enough to maintain their profitable arrangement while protecting his more complicated commitments. It was actually quite romantic, in a sociopathic sort of way. As they settled into breakfast at their marble-topped island, surrounded by the warm luxury of their perfectly appointed kitchen, Taraji's mind drifted back to their fairy tale beginning. The transformation of their relationship from business partnership to passionate romance had been swift and overwhelming, like being caught in a beautiful hurricane that you only later realized had been carefully engineered by meteorologists. "I've been thinking about our European expansion," Wesley said, scrolling through emails on his phone while eating. "The Venetti deal opens up some interesting possibilities for broader market penetration." "Oh." Taraji kept her voice carefully neutral, though internally she smiled at how predictably he moved conversations toward business when he was planning something. "I think we should consider accelerating the timeline. Maybe fast-track some of the corporate restructuring to take advantage of favorable international tax considerations." Corporate restructuring. How romantic. Wesley's euphemisms for gradually stealing her company had become quite creative over the years. "That sounds complex," she said. "Would that affect the ownership structure we discussed last year?" "Potentially, but don't worry about the technical details. My attorneys can handle all the complicated legal work. You should focus on what you do best, creating beautiful things that make us both rich." The patronizing tone would have been infuriating if she hadn't been expecting it. Wesley had perfected the art of making theft sound like protection, manipulation sound like support. "Of course," she agreed. "I trust your judgment completely." The satisfaction that flickered across his features was quickly hidden, but she caught it. Wesley loved nothing more than confirmation that his psychological manipulation was working perfectly. A soft chime from the elevator interrupted their breakfast theater. Wesley frowned. It was only 8:30 in the morning, and they weren't expecting any visitors. The elevator doors opened to reveal Mirelin, looking uncharacteristically serious in a tailored navy blazer and designer jeans, her auburn hair swept into a professional chignon that suggested this wasn't a social call. "Sorry to interrupt the newlywed moment," she said, but her usual grin was notably absent. "Taraji, we need to discuss the quarterly financials before the board meeting." "Of course," Taraji said, immediately shifting into business mode. "Wesley, I'm sorry to cut breakfast short, but—" "Don't apologize for being brilliant," he said, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Go build your empire. I'll be here when you get back, probably boring myself to death with quarterly reports." The phrase "your empire" was particularly amusing, considering that according to his legal documents, he now owned approximately 70% of it. But Wesley had always enjoyed allowing her to feel like she was in control while he systematically dismantled her autonomy. As Taraji headed upstairs to change, she caught Wesley's reflection in the hallway mirror, noticing how his expression changed the moment he thought she couldn't see him. The warm smile faded, replaced by something colder, more calculating as he reached for his phone and began typing rapidly. 40 minutes later, dressed in one of her own designs, a stunning burgundy silk suit that commanded attention without sacrificing sophistication, Taraji sat in the back of their Mercedes as their driver navigated Manhattan traffic toward Luthen Luxury's headquarters. "You're different today," Mirelin observed, studying her friend's profile. "More focused." "Big day ahead," Taraji replied. "The Venetti meeting is crucial for our European expansion." And Wesley's supportive of the international growth? Extraordinarily supportive, almost suspiciously so. Mirellen raised an eyebrow. Suspiciously? Nothing specific, just a feeling that his enthusiasm for expanding my business internationally might have motives beyond marital devotion. Such as the fact that international corporate structures can be excellent vehicles for asset transfer if you know how to manipulate the legal frameworks. Taraji's voice was matter-of-fact, as if she were discussing the weather. Mirellen stared at her. Taraji, what aren't you telling me? For a moment, Taraji considered revealing the truth, that she had known about Wesley's systematic fraud for over 2.5 years, that she had been carefully documenting his crimes while building her own defensive strategies, that tonight's anniversary party might be the beginning of the end game she had been planning. Instead, she smiled and said, "Just pre-meeting nerves. You know how important this deal is for our future." Our future. The phrase meant something entirely different than Mirellen realized. The meeting with Antonio Vanetti went exactly as Taraji had expected. The distinguished Italian was charmed by her vision for expanding their signature silk innovations throughout European markets, and by the time they shook hands 3 hours later, they had the framework for a deal that would establish Lathan Luxury as a global powerhouse. Magnificent, Vanetti said in his melodious accent, kissing Taraji's hand with old-world gallantry. You have created something truly revolutionary, Mrs. Hemsworth. Your husband must be very proud of your achievements. He claims to be, Taraji replied, and something in her tone made Vanetti look at her more sharply. Claims to be? I'm sorry, that came out wrong. Wesley is incredibly supportive. Sometimes I think he's more excited about my success than I am, which was certainly true, considering that her success was literally funding his lifestyle and providing him with assets to steal. As they left the building, Mirellen was practically bouncing with excitement. $200 million, Taraji. Can you believe it? We're going to be the youngest self-made billionaires in fashion history. We're going to be something, Taraji agreed, though her definition of something was probably quite different from Mirellen's. Her phone buzzed with a text from Wesley. How did it go, beautiful? Can't wait to celebrate tonight. Have a surprise waiting for you at home. She smiled, typing back. It went amazingly. Can't wait to see what you have planned. Another surprise. Wesley's surprises had become increasingly elaborate as his theft of her company neared completion. Tonight's would probably be particularly memorable, considering that it might also be the last one he ever had the opportunity to orchestrate. As their car merged into afternoon traffic, Taraji gazed out at the city she had conquered through talent, determination, and, more recently, strategic patience. Tomorrow, she would start planning the European expansion that would cement her legacy as one of the most successful fashion entrepreneurs of her generation. She had no way of knowing that tomorrow would also bring a 7-year-old girl whose innocent words would provide the perfect catalyst for a plan that had been 2.5 years in the making. Actually, that was a lie. She knew exactly what tomorrow would bring because she had been planning it for longer than anyone could have imagined. Chapter 3. Shadows in Paradise. The surprise Wesley had promised turned out to be a private dinner on their rooftop terrace, complete with a string quartet, her favorite white roses from Ecuador, and a table set with the Limoges china they had received as a wedding gift from a French duchess whose chateau Wesley had helped save from bankruptcy. Taraji stood at the edge of their terrace, Manhattan glittering like a jeweled tapestry beneath them, feeling like she was watching the final act of a very long, very complex play as Wesley approached with 2 glasses of Armand de Brignac champagne, the same vintage they had shared on their wedding night in Tuscany. "To the most brilliant woman I've ever known," he said, his green eyes reflecting the city lights as he handed her a glass. "And to conquering Europe together." Together, she echoed, touching her glass to his, though she noted how seamlessly he inserted himself into her achievements. After 5 years of marriage and 2.5 years of careful observation, Wesley's linguistic patterns had become as predictable as sunrise. They settled at the candle-lit table, and Wesley signaled the quartet to begin playing. The haunting melody of Pachelbel's canon filled the air, the same piece that had played during their first dance as husband and wife, back when she had still believed in the fairy tale he was selling. "This is absolutely perfect," Taraji said, leaning across to squeeze his hand. "But you didn't have to go to all this trouble just because I signed a contract." "It's not just any contract," Wesley replied, his thumb tracing circles on her palm in a gesture that had once made her melt and now made her calculate. "This is the deal that's going to establish Lathan Luxury as the premier fashion house in the world. You've earned this celebration." "We've earned this celebration," she corrected silently. After all, Wesley's systematic manipulation of her corporate structure over the past 5 years had been quite impressive in its scope and sophistication. He deserved some credit for his criminal enterprise. As they talked through dinner, Wesley's famous chef had prepared a 7-course tasting menu that was pure artistry on porcelain. Taraji found herself admiring her husband's performance. After 5 years, she knew every expression, every micro-emotion that crossed his features, but his ability to project sincerity while planning betrayal was genuinely remarkable. "Wesley," she said carefully, "I've been thinking about our conversation this morning, about the corporate restructuring for international expansion." "What about it?" "I want to make sure I understand the implications. Would accelerating the timeline affect my equity position in the company?" For just a moment, so briefly someone less observant might have missed it, his hand tightened around his wine glass. Then he smiled, the expression warm and reassuring, and completely rehearsed. "Sweetheart, you're overthinking this. The restructuring is designed to protect and enhance your position, not diminish it. My legal team has structured everything to maximize tax advantages while preserving your creative control." Creative control. Not ownership, not equity, not decision-making authority. Creative control, which was corporate speak for, "You can keep designing pretty things while I own everything you create." "But hypothetically," she pressed, "if something happened to our marriage, what would happen to the company?" Wesley's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "Why would you ask something like that?" "Just curious about the legal protections. You know how paranoid I get about business security." "Nothing will happen to our marriage," he said firmly. "But if you're worried about it, we can always review the prenuptial agreements to make sure you feel completely protected. The prenuptial agreements that would leave her with essentially nothing if their marriage ended under any circumstances that could be construed as her fault. Those prenuptial agreements." "That would be wonderful," she said warmly. "I trust your judgment completely." Wesley's smile was brilliant with satisfaction. He loved confirmation that his psychological manipulation was working perfectly, that she remained the compliant, trusting wife who never questioned his increasingly complex financial maneuvering. His phone buzzed against the table, and his entire demeanor shifted. The romantic husband disappeared, replaced by the ruthless businessman who had built a tech empire through sheer force of will. "I'm sorry, I have to take this," he said, already standing. "It's about the monthly arrangements." As he walked to the far side of the terrace, speaking in low, urgent tones, Taraji found herself listening to fragments of the conversation. She caught pieces, something about keeping payments discreet, maintaining separate accounts, and ensuring that the arrangements stayed completely invisible from Manhattan operations. When he returned to the table 15 minutes later, his smile was perfectly in place, but there was tension around his eyes that suggested the call hadn't gone as smoothly as he'd hoped. "Crisis averted," he said lightly. You know how it is with international operations. Of course, Taraji agreed, though she knew Wesley's business well enough to know that he rarely handled operational issues personally, especially not with the kind of secrecy she had just witnessed. Her own phone rang, providing a welcome interruption to Wesley's increasingly transparent lies. "Zirelia," she answered, recognizing her college friend's number. "Is everything okay? It's pretty late." "I'm so sorry to bother you," came Zirelia's voice, tight with an emotion that Taraji had learned to recognize as guilt mixed with desperation. "I know you and Wesley are probably celebrating, but I have a small emergency. My babysitter just cancelled for tomorrow night, and I have that job interview I can't reschedule. I was wondering—" "Of course we can watch Arisha," Taraji said immediately, though she noticed how Wesley's expression changed when she mentioned the little girl's name. "You know we love having her here. Thank you so much. I'll drop her off around 6 tomorrow evening. And Taraji, tell Wesley thank you for me, for everything." The line went dead before Taraji could ask what she meant, though of course she already knew. "Zirelia's bringing Arisha over tomorrow night," she told Wesley, who had been listening to the conversation with careful attention. "That's fine," he said, but his tone was oddly flat. "I'll make sure to pick up some of those architectural supplies she likes." "You spoil that little girl," Taraji said fondly. "She adores you." Something flickered across Wesley's face. Guilt, fear, anticipation. It was gone too quickly for most people to identify, but Taraji had become an expert in reading her husband's micro-expressions. "All children should be spoiled sometimes," he said carefully, "especially ones who don't have stable father figures in their lives." It was a reasonable response, but something about his tone was off. Wesley had always been wonderful with children, but his relationship with 7-year-old Arisha seemed particularly intense. The child lit up around him in a way that suggested familiarity far beyond the occasional babysitting arrangement. "Wesley," she said slowly, "how often do you see Arisha when I'm not around?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, she seems very comfortable with you. More comfortable than I would expect for someone who only sees you occasionally when her mother needs help." Wesley's laugh sounded forced. "She's a sweet kid, and I enjoy encouraging her interest in architecture. Is there something wrong with that?" "No, of course not. I think it's wonderful that you take such an interest in her development." "Such an interest in his daughter's development," she corrected silently. "You seem tense tonight," she observed. "Is everything all right?" "Just thinking about tomorrow's anniversary celebration. I want everything to be perfect for you." "Perfect?" "Yes, tomorrow night would certainly be perfect, though probably not in the way Wesley was anticipating." That night, as Wesley slept beside her, Taraji lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind running through the final details of a plan that had been over 2.5 years in the making. She thought about the evidence she had carefully gathered, the financial structures she had secretly established, the international partnerships that existed completely outside Wesley's knowledge or control. Most of all, she thought about 7-year-old Arisha, whose innocent honesty would tomorrow night provide the perfect catalyst for bringing down the house of cards that Wesley had spent 5 years constructing. He had taught her to be strategic, to think 10 moves ahead, to never reveal your true intentions until you were ready to strike. Tomorrow night, she would demonstrate exactly how well she had learned those lessons. The student was about to become the master, and Wesley Hemsworth was about to discover that he had made the mistake of teaching ruthlessness to someone who was naturally better at it than he was. As sleep finally claimed her in the early hours of the morning, Taraji's dreams were filled with the sound of champagne glasses breaking and the sight of carefully constructed facades crumbling into ruins. Tomorrow night, the performance would finally end, and the real story would begin. Chapter 4. The Calm Before the Storm. The golden afternoon light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Wesley's study caught every detail of the scene that would have looked heartwarming to any casual observer. A successful businessman patiently teaching a 7-year-old girl the fundamentals of architectural design, their heads bent together over blueprints and sketches with the kind of focused attention that suggested this was far from their first such collaboration. Taraji stood in the doorway, watching Wesley guide little Arisha's hand as she traced structural lines with a small ruler, his voice low and patient as he explained concepts that seemed remarkably advanced for a child her age. "Now, if we put the support beam here," Wesley was saying, "what happens to the weight distribution?" "It goes to the corners," Arisha said excitedly, her dark eyes that were unmistakably identical to Wesley's, shining with understanding. "Just like you taught me before." "Exactly right, sweetheart. You're going to be a brilliant architect someday." The pride in Wesley's voice was unmistakable, but it wasn't the casual affection of a family friend encouraging a child's interests. It was something deeper, more personal, more possessive. Taraji had heard that exact tone when Wesley spoke about his own achievements, his own legacy, his own genetic superiority. His own daughter. "I hope you're not filling her head with too many big dreams," Zeralia said from behind Taraji, her voice carrying that familiar mixture of gratitude and guilt that had become her signature emotional state over the past year. Taraji turned to study her college friend's face, noting the dark circles under her eyes and the way her hands trembled slightly as she clutched her designer purse, yet another expensive item that didn't match her supposed financial struggles as a freelance photographer. "There's nothing wrong with big dreams," Taraji said carefully. "Though I have to ask Zeralia, that dress Arisha is wearing, those shoes, even her hair accessories, they look like they cost more than most people spend on children's clothes in a year. How are you managing that kind of expense?" The color drained from Zeralia's face so quickly that Taraji actually took a step forward, concerned her friend might faint. Someone gave them to me," Zeralia stammered. "A client who was cleaning out her daughter's closet. You know how rich people are, they barely wear things once before getting rid of them." It was a reasonable explanation delivered by someone who had clearly rehearsed it multiple times, but Zeralia couldn't meet her eyes when she said it. More tellingly, her gaze kept drifting toward Wesley and Arisha with an expression that looked like a mixture of longing and terror. "Mommy, look!" Arisha called out, holding up her drawing. Mr. Wesley, taught me how to make buildings that won't fall down in earthquakes." The slip was so quick, so innocent, that most people would have dismissed it as a child's confusion. But Taraji had been documenting exactly these kinds of moments for over 2 years, ever since she had first begun to suspect the true nature of Wesley's relationship with Zeralia and her daughter. "That's wonderful, baby," Zeralia said quickly, but her voice was strained. "Why don't you show Aunt Taraji what else you've been working on?" As Arisha bounded over with her drawing, Taraji knelt to examine the child's work. The architectural concepts were surprisingly sophisticated for a 7-year-old, the kind of understanding that came from extended, detailed instruction rather than casual playtime. "This is incredible, sweetheart," Taraji said honestly. "How long have you been learning about buildings?" "Since I was really little," Arisha said enthusiastically. "Daddy, Mr. Wesley, has been teaching me for my whole life practically. He even gave me my own drawing table at home with real architect tools. A drafting table with professional tools. Not the kind of gift a family friend would casually purchase for someone else's child, but exactly the kind of investment a father would make in his daughter's education." "That was very generous," Taraji said, looking up to find Wesley watching them with an expression of carefully controlled panic. "Every future architect needs proper tools," Wesley replied, but there was something defensive in his tone that confirmed everything Taraji had already figured out. Zerelia quickly moved to distract Arisha with promises of ice cream, but not before Taraji caught the desperate look that passed between her friend and her husband. It was the kind of silent communication that only came from shared secrets, shared guilt, shared stakes in keeping certain truths hidden. "I should go," Zerelia said abruptly. "The interview is in an hour, and I need to prepare." She knelt to kiss Arisha goodbye, whispering something in the child's ear that made the little girl nod solemnly. Then she stood, hugged Taraji quickly, and headed for the elevator without making eye contact with Wesley. "Thank you again," she called as the elevator doors closed. "I'll pick her up in the morning." The penthouse felt charged with tension after Zerelia's departure, filled with undercurrents that Taraji was pretending to just now begin to understand. Wesley had returned to his study, supposedly to handle some urgent emails, while Arisha settled in the living room with her coloring books and the expensive art supplies that, Taraji now realized, were permanently kept in their guest room. How long had they been keeping art supplies specifically for this child? How often did Arisha visit when Taraji was conveniently away on business trips? "Aunt Taraji?" Arisha's small voice interrupted her spiraling thoughts. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course, sweetheart. Do you think Mr. Wesley would be a good daddy?" The question was delivered with the innocent directness that only children possessed, but it hit Taraji like a physical blow. She stared at the little girl, noting for the first time how her dark curls caught the light exactly the way Wesley's hair did, how her chin had the same stubborn set, how her hands moved with the same unconscious elegance. "That's an interesting question," Taraji managed. "Why do you ask?" "Because Mommy says he already kind of is one. She says he takes care of us like daddies are supposed to take care of their families, but we have to be careful about who we tell because not everyone would understand." The world seemed to tilt sideways. Even though Taraji had known this truth for over 2 years, hearing it confirmed by the innocent honesty of a 7-year-old child still carried an emotional impact that she hadn't fully prepared for. "Arisha, honey, how often does Mr. Wesley visit you and your mommy?" "Lots of times. He comes every week, sometimes more. He brings me presents and helps Mommy with scary papers from the bank, and sometimes he takes us to dinner at really fancy restaurants where everyone knows his name." Weekly visits, financial support, fancy restaurants where the staff knew Wesley personally. This wasn't casual friendship. This was a pattern of paternal involvement that had been carefully hidden from Taraji for years. "Does your mommy seem happy when Mr. Wesley visits?" Arisha considered this with the seriousness that only children could bring to complex emotional questions. "Sometimes, but sometimes she cries after he leaves. She thinks I don't see, but I do." "Why do you think she cries?" "I think it's because she loves him, but she can't tell anyone, like in the movies when people have secret loves that make them sad." Out of the mouths of babes. Arisha had just summarized the entire situation with the clarity that only came from a child's unfiltered observation of adult behavior. "Arisha," Taraji said carefully, "do you know when your birthday is?" "November 20th. I just turned 7 last month." November 20th, 7 years ago. That put Arisha's conception in February 2018. Exactly 7¾ years ago, just 2 months after Wesley had met Taraji at the charity gala, but right when he had reconnected with Zerelia. Wesley had reconnected with Zerelia and gotten her pregnant while he was simultaneously pursuing Taraji as his next target. Then, when Arisha was born 7 years ago, he had continued developing his relationship with Taraji while maintaining his secret family. "Aunt Taraji, are you okay? You look sad." Taraji forced a smile, though it felt like her face might crack from the effort. "I'm fine, sweetheart, just thinking about some grown-up things." But she wasn't fine. Even though she had known this truth for over 2 years, even though she had been carefully planning for this moment, hearing it confirmed by the innocent honesty of a 7-year-old child still felt like having her heart ripped out of her chest and handed back to her in pieces. Wesley had been living a triple life since before their relationship had even begun. The man she had loved completely, trusted absolutely, built a future with. He had been supporting another woman and raising his biological daughter while playing the role of devoted husband. "Mr. Wesley," Arisha called out as footsteps approached from the study. "Can we work on the castle design now?" Wesley appeared in the doorway, and Taraji watched his face transform as his gaze fell on the little girl. The cold, calculating businessman disappeared, replaced by someone softer, warmer, more genuinely affectionate than she had ever seen him with anyone else, including her. "Of course we can, Princess," he said, and the endearment hit Taraji like a slap. Princess. He called his secret daughter Princess with the same natural affection that he called Taraji beautiful or sweetheart. This wasn't performance or manipulation. This was genuine paternal love. As Wesley settled on the floor beside Arisha, pulling out a new set of colored pencils that he had obviously brought specifically for her, Taraji realized that tomorrow night's anniversary party wasn't going to be the celebration of their perfect love that their guests expected. It was going to be the night when Wesley's perfect dual life finally, irrevocably, fell apart. Because while he had been teaching her to be strategic and ruthless over the past 5 years, he had forgotten that the best students often surpass their teachers. Tomorrow night, Arisha's innocent honesty would provide the catalyst, but the explosion that followed would be entirely Taraji's design. Wesley Hemsworth was about to learn that he had made the fatal error of underestimating the woman whose life he had tried to steal. Chapter 5. The First Earthquake. The crystal chandelier had never looked more magnificent than it did, reflecting off 300 champagne glasses raised in celebration. But Taraji Lathan Hemsworth felt like she was standing at the epicenter of an earthquake as she watched the final moments of her 5-year performance draw to its carefully orchestrated close. "To the most enviable couple in Manhattan," called out Senator Harrison, his voice carrying across the penthouse's main reception room, "may you have 50 more years of happiness." The crowd erupted in applause and hear-hears, but Taraji barely registered the sound. She was too busy watching 7-year-old Arisha, who had arrived an hour earlier with Zeralia and immediately sought out Wesley, like a compass needle finding true north. The child was currently standing near the windows, animated in conversation with Mirella about the architectural features of the building, but her eyes kept drifting to Wesley with unmistakable adoration, the kind of adoration that daughters reserved for their fathers. "You look absolutely radiant tonight," whispered Margaret Ashworth, the society doyenne whose approval could make or break Manhattan's social climbers. At 85, she had witnessed enough scandals to recognize the signs when a perfect facade was about to crack. "Though I must say there's something different about your energy tonight, dear. Something almost electric." "Just overwhelmed by all the love in the room," Taraji replied automatically, her social training allowing her to function even as she counted down the minutes until detonation. Wesley appeared at her elbow, devastatingly handsome in his custom Armani tuxedo, his green eyes warm as they focused on her face. To any observer, he looked like a man completely devoted to his wife. But Taraji could see the careful calculation behind his expressions, the way he monitored the room even as he played the loving husband. "Dance with me," he murmured, extending his hand. She allowed him to lead her to the small area they had cleared for dancing, where other couples swayed to the music of the live jazz ensemble Wesley had flown in from New Orleans. As his arms encircled her waist, she caught Zeralia watching them from across the room, her face a mask of pain so profound that Taraji almost felt sorry for her. "Almost. You've been quiet tonight," Wesley said, his breath warm against her ear. "Are you feeling all right?" Just thinking about how perfect everything looks, she replied, and the irony of the truth disguised as small talk was almost delicious. It is perfect, he agreed, spinning her gracefully. We're perfect. The words that once would have made her heart soar now felt like the final lines of a play she was eager to finish. How many times had he said similar things to Zerelia? How many promises had he made that he never intended to keep? Wesley, she said carefully, I've been thinking about what we discussed regarding expansion, about building something that will last. She felt him tense almost imperceptibly, his hand tightening on her waist. What about it? I want to move faster. I want to start building our family. I'm 42, and if we're going to have children, let's not discuss this here. He interrupted, his voice carrying a sharp edge that made several nearby couples glance their way. When, then? Every time I bring it up, you change the subject or find an excuse to postpone the conversation. For a moment, his carefully constructed mask slipped, and she saw something ugly in his expression. Irritation, calculation, even a flash of what might have been panic. Taraji, you're being unreasonable. We've discussed this. The business expansion, the European deals, this isn't the right time. It's never the right time with you, she said, her voice carrying just enough to be heard by nearby dancers. But maybe that's because you already have a child. The words hung in the air between them like a live grenade. Wesley's face went completely white, his green eyes wide with shock and something that looked like terror. What are you talking about? I'm talking about Erisha. I'm talking about the weekly visits, the drafting table, the expensive clothes, the way she looks at you like you're the center of her universe. I'm talking about the fact that she has your eyes, your chin, your mannerisms. You're being paranoid, he said, but his voice lacked any conviction. Am I? Then explain to me why a 7-year-old child has been visiting our home regularly for years. Explain why you pay for her clothes, her toys, her education. Explain why she calls helping her with homework our special time together. Each accusation landed like a physical blow, and Wesley's facade cracked a little more with each word. Around them, other couples continued dancing, but Taraji could see Margaret Ashworth watching them with sharp, calculating eyes that missed nothing. Taraji, please, not here. Not here? Then where, Wesley? In the privacy of our bedroom while you continue lying to my face? In your study while you video call your other family? When exactly is the appropriate time to discuss the fact that my husband has been living a double life since before we even met? Ladies and gentlemen, the voice of their party coordinator cut through the music and conversation like a knife, drawing everyone's attention to the small stage where the jazz ensemble had been playing. Mr. and Mrs. Hemsworth would like to say a few words. The timing was perfect, exactly as Taraji had planned when she had arranged this moment 6 months ago. 300 pairs of eyes turned toward them expectantly, cameras and phones raised to capture what everyone assumed would be another romantic gesture from Manhattan's golden couple. Wesley's face transformed with the speed of a professional actor, the panicked, guilty expression replaced by his public smile. He took her hand, leading her toward the stage with the confidence of a man who had built his fortune on convincing people to believe in carefully constructed illusions. Thank you all for being here tonight, he began, his voice steady and warm. 5 years ago, I was the luckiest man in New York when this incredible woman agreed to be my wife. The crowd murmured appreciatively, but Taraji felt like she was watching the performance from outside her own body. In just a few moments, Wesley's world would explode, and she wanted to remember every detail of his destruction. Tonight, I want to renew my commitment to the woman who has transformed my life in every possible way, Wesley continued, reaching into his jacket pocket to pull out a small velvet box. Taraji, you are my heart, my soul, my everything. The gasps from the crowd were audible as he dropped to one knee, opening the box to reveal a stunning 20-carat emerald surrounded by diamonds, a ring that probably cost more than most people's houses. Will you marry me again? In front of all our friends and family, will you let me prove that our love is strong enough to last forever? The crowd held its collective breath, cameras flashing, everyone waiting for her response to what appeared to be the most romantic gesture in Manhattan social history. But Taraji was looking past Wesley to where little Arisha stood with Zeralia near the windows, the child's face bright with excitement as she watched what she clearly thought was a wonderful surprise. "That's beautiful, Wesley," Taraji said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent room. "But before I answer, I think our guests should know about the rest of our family." Wesley's face went completely white. "Taraji, what are you—" "Arisha, sweetheart," Taraji called out, her voice warm and encouraging. "Come here for a moment." The little girl looked to her mother for permission, then ran across the room toward the stage, her excitement evident in every step. The crowd watched with indulgent smiles, charmed by the child's enthusiasm and completely unaware that they were about to witness the most spectacular revelation in Manhattan's social history. "Mr. Wesley!" Arisha exclaimed as she reached the stage. "Are you really going to marry Aunt Taraji again?" That's the plan, sweetheart," Wesley managed, still kneeling with the ring extended, trapped by his own romantic gesture. "That's so exciting!" Arisha bounced on her toes, then looked out at the sea of elegant guests. "Does this mean I can call you Daddy at the wedding instead of just at home?" The words echoed through the suddenly silent penthouse like a gunshot. 300 champagne glasses seemed to freeze mid-sip. The jazz ensemble's music faltered and stopped. Even the city sounds from outside seemed to fade into absolute quiet. Arisha, oblivious to the devastation she had just unleashed, continued chattering happily. "Mommy always says I have to call you Mr. Wesley when other people are around, but you're my daddy. And if you're marrying Aunt Taraji again, does that make her my step-mommy? Because that would be so cool." The silence that followed was deafening. Taraji watched as understanding dawned across 300 faces simultaneously, the shock, the disbelief, the rapid mental calculations as Manhattan's elite processed what they had just heard. Wesley was still frozen on one knee, the emerald ring catching the light from the chandelier. His green eyes, the same distinctive green eyes that belonged to the little girl beside him, filled with absolute terror. Zeralia was pushing through the crowd, her face stricken with horror as she reached for Arisha. "Baby, we need to go. Right now." But it was too late. The secret was out. The perfect facade had crumbled. Margaret Ashworth was the first to break the silence, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Well," she said dryly, "this is certainly more entertaining than I expected." And with those words, the whispers began, a low murmur that grew steadily louder as 300 guests began to understand what they had just witnessed. Phone cameras were already recording, social media posts were being crafted, and the story of Wesley Hemsworth's secret family was about to become the scandal of the decade. Taraji stood on the stage, still wearing her perfect anniversary gown, still beautiful and poised and elegant, but now also publicly vindicated in front of everyone who mattered in her world. Wesley was still on one knee, the 20-carat ring in his outstretched hand, his carefully constructed life lying in ruins around him. And somewhere in the crowd, little Arisha was asking in confusion, "Did I say something wrong?" The first earthquake was complete, but as Taraji looked out at the sea of shocked faces, she smiled, because this was only the beginning. Chapter 6. The Deeper Betrayal. The silence that followed Arisha's innocent confession stretched like a taut wire about to snap, until Taraji realized that 300 pairs of eyes were still focused on her, waiting to see how Manhattan's most enviable wife would respond to the revelation that her perfect marriage had been built on the most devastating foundation of lies. She looked down at Wesley, still frozen on one knee, with the 20-carat emerald ring extended toward her like an offering to gods who had already turned their backs on him. His green eyes, those same distinctive green eyes that she now knew beyond doubt belonged to little Arisha, held a desperation so profound that for a moment she almost felt sorry for him. Almost. "Get up, Wesley," she said quietly, her voice carrying clearly in the unnatural hush that had fallen over the penthouse. "Taraji, please let me explain. I said get up." Wesley rose slowly, his hands shaking as he closed the ring box. Around them, the society photographers' cameras continued to flash, capturing every moment of what would undoubtedly become the most talked-about scandal in Manhattan social history. "Ladies and gentlemen," Taraji said, her voice gaining strength as she addressed the crowd. Years of running board meetings and fashion presentations had taught her how to command a room, even when her carefully orchestrated world was appearing to crumble around her. "Thank you for celebrating what we thought was our 5th anniversary. Unfortunately, it appears the party is over." The murmur that had been building finally broke free, becoming a wave of shocked conversation as guests processed what they had just witnessed. Zirelia had managed to collect Arisha and was pushing toward the elevator, the little girl's confused questions barely audible over the growing noise. "Thank you all for coming," Wesley said, attempting to salvage some dignity from the wreckage. "If you'll excuse us, my wife and I need to discuss some private matters." But Taraji was already walking away from him, her golden silk gown flowing behind her like liquid sunlight as she moved through the crowd of stunned guests. She needed air, space, distance from the man she had been systematically destroying, and the performance she was now ready to conclude. Mirelan intercepted her near the windows, her face pale with shock and fury. What the hell just happened? Did that little girl just call Wesley her father? "Yes," Taraji said simply, surprised by how calm her voice sounded when everything inside her was calculating the next phase of her plan. "Jesus Christ, how long have you known?" "About 2.5 years. And you're just letting this come out now, at your anniversary party, in front of half of Manhattan's elite?" Taraji smiled, an expression that held no warmth whatsoever. "I'm a strategic businesswoman, Mirelan. I don't let anything just happen, especially not something this important." Before Mirelan could ask what she meant, Wesley appeared beside them, having managed to clear most of the guests from the immediate area. His face had lost all pretense of composure, revealing the panic and desperation underneath. "Taraji, please, we need to talk privately. This isn't what it looks like." "Really?" she said, turning to face him fully. "Because what it looks like is that you've been living a double life for our entire marriage. What it looks like is that you have a 7-year-old daughter with my best friend, and you've been supporting them financially while playing the role of devoted husband to me." "It's complicated. Is she your daughter?" The directness of the question seemed to catch him off guard. For a moment, his carefully constructed defenses crumbled completely, and she saw the truth written across his face before he could formulate another lie. "Yes," he whispered, "but Taraji, you have to understand." "I don't have to understand anything." The words came out like chips of ice. "What I need to understand is the timeline. When did your affair with Zirelia begin?" Wesley's face went completely white. "Taraji, when, Wesley?" 7.75 years ago. The confirmation was exactly what she had expected, but she played her role perfectly, letting the calculated shock register on her features. 7.75 years ago put the beginning of his affair with Zirelia just 2 months after he had met Taraji at the charity gala. "You were with her before you even proposed to me," she said, allowing the devastation to color her voice. "The devoted husband, the supportive partner, none of it was real." "That's not true. What I felt for you was real. What we built together was real." "Was it? Or was I just another acquisition for your portfolio?" The question seemed to strike him like a slap, and Taraji had to admire her own performance. After 2.5 years of planning this moment, she could deliver devastating accusations with just the right mixture of pain and growing understanding. As if summoned by her words, a new voice cut through their confrontation. "Mrs. Hemsworth, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's something urgent you need to see." They turned to find James Morrison, Wesley's personal attorney, looking deeply uncomfortable as he approached with a thick manila folder in his hands. James had been feeding Taraji information for over 18 months, ever since she had approached him with evidence of Wesley's pattern of financial fraud. "James, this really isn't the time," Wesley began. "Actually, sir, I think it is. Mrs. Hemsworth asked me to review the corporate structure for the European expansion deal, and I discovered some irregularities that require immediate attention." Taraji felt a familiar thrill of anticipation. This was the moment she had been building toward for over 2 years, the revelation that would destroy Wesley completely while positioning her as the brilliant victim who had discovered his systematic theft. "What kind of irregularities?" she asked, her voice perfectly pitched with growing concern. James glanced nervously between her and Wesley, playing his assigned role flawlessly. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately." "No," Taraji said firmly. "Whatever it is, I want to hear it now." "Very well. It appears that over the past 5 years, Mr. Hemsworth has been systematically acquiring shares in Latham Luxury through a series of shell companies. Based on my analysis, he currently owns approximately 75% of your company." The words hit the remaining guests like a physical blow. Taraji staggered backward, allowing Mirellan's steadying hand to keep her upright while she processed this devastating news that she had helped orchestrate. "That's impossible," she whispered, her voice breaking with just the right amount of betrayed shock. "I own my company. I built it from nothing." "Yes, ma'am, you did, but the convertible preferred stock arrangement from Mr. Hemsworth's initial investment included clauses that allowed him to acquire additional shares under certain circumstances. He's been exercising those options regularly, using profits from Hemsworth Industries to purchase equity through intermediary companies." "You bastard," Mirellan snarled, taking a step toward Wesley. "You absolute fucking bastard." "It's not what you think," Wesley said desperately. "I was protecting the company, protecting our future." "Protecting it from whom?" Taraji asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "From me? You don't understand business the way I do. Fashion is volatile, unpredictable. I was ensuring that Latham Luxury would survive market fluctuations, economic downturns, by stealing it from me, by securing it for our future, for our family." "What family?" The words exploded out of her with enough force to make nearby guests turn and stare. "You already have a family. You have a daughter with another woman, and now I find out you've been slowly stealing my company for 5 years. I can explain everything." "Can you explain the prenuptial agreement?" James Morrison interrupted quietly, right on cue. "Because that's another issue we need to discuss publicly." Taraji turned to stare at the attorney, delivering her lines with perfect timing. "Yes. Let's make sure everyone understands what the prenup contains. The morality clauses are very specific. If the marriage is dissolved due to what the agreement terms misconduct on your part, you forfeit all claims to marital assets, including any stake in jointly held businesses." "That's right," Taraji said, her voice carrying calculated outrage. "I signed a prenup that was designed to trap me. If I leave him for any reason that could be construed as damaging his reputation, I lose everything." "No, ma'am, but the agreement is broadly written. Any action that could be interpreted as harming Mr. Hemsworth's reputation or business interests could potentially trigger those clauses." The trap was so elegant, so perfectly constructed that Taraji almost had to admire Wesley's sophistication, even though she had been documenting its construction for over 2 years and had already developed comprehensive strategies to destroy it. "You planned this," she said, turning to stare at her husband with manufactured, dawning understanding. "All of it. The investment, the marriage, the prenup. You planned to steal my company from the very beginning." "I planned to build something together," Wesley said, but his voice lacked conviction. "No, you planned to take what I built and make it yours, just like you took what you had with Zerelia and made it secret, just like you took my trust and made it into a weapon against me." Around them, the few remaining guests were making no pretense of not listening. This wasn't just a private marital disagreement anymore. This was a public destruction of one of Manhattan's most powerful couples, complete with business fraud and secret families. Margaret Ashworth's voice cut through the tension with surgical precision. "Ladies and gentlemen, I think perhaps it's time we allowed the happy couple some privacy." But as the remaining guests began to file toward the elevator, Taraji realized that privacy was exactly what she didn't want. These people, society reporters, business associates, influential friends, were witnesses to the truth, and their testimony would be crucial for the next phase of her plan. "James," she said quietly, "I want you to prepare a complete forensic audit of all transactions between Hemsworth Industries and Lathan Luxury over the past 5 years. I want to know every penny that changed hands and exactly how those shell companies were structured. Mrs. Hemsworth, I should point out that I represent Mr. Hemsworth's interests." "Not anymore," she said, her voice gaining strength with each word. "As of right now, you work for me. And if you're not comfortable with that arrangement, I'll find someone who is." James nodded slowly, exactly as they had rehearsed. "I'll begin immediately, ma'am. And Mrs. Hemsworth, you should know that I've been documenting irregularities for some time. I have substantial evidence that Mr. Hemsworth's actions constitute fraud." Wesley's face had gone completely pale. "Taraji, you're making a mistake. We can work this out." "The only mistake I made was trusting you." She turned away from him, her golden gown flowing behind her like a battle flag. "Get out of my house. This is my house too." "Get out," she repeated, her voice carrying the authority of a woman who had built an empire and wasn't about to let anyone take it from her. "Get out before I call security and have you removed." As Wesley finally left, his shoulders bowed in defeat, Taraji stood alone in the wreckage of her perfect life, surrounded by empty champagne glasses and wilted flowers. To any observer, everything she had believed about her marriage, her future, her very identity, had been shattered in the space of a single evening. But as she looked out at the Manhattan skyline glittering beyond her windows, she felt something cold and triumphant settling in her chest. Phase 1 of her plan was complete. Wesley's reputation was destroyed, his secret was exposed, and his systematic theft of her company was now documented and witnessed. Tomorrow, Phase 2 would begin. Wesley Hemsworth had spent 5 years teaching her to be ruthless, calculating, and strategic. He was about to discover that she had been a far better student than he had ever imagined. Chapter 7. Rising from the ashes. The champagne had gone flat, the flowers were wilting, and the perfect anniversary party lay in ruins around her. But Taraji Lathan Hemsworth had never felt more clearly focused in her entire life as she stood in her marble-floored kitchen at 3 a.m, surrounded by legal documents and financial records that painted a picture of calculated deception spanning 5 years, evidence she had been carefully assembling for over 2.5 years. "Your credit cards have been frozen," Mirellen reported grimly, hanging up her phone after speaking with the bank's emergency services line. "All of them, even the ones tied to Lathan Luxury's business accounts." "Of course they have," Taraji said calmly, not looking up from the corporate filing she was reviewing. Wesley's not stupid. He knows I'll fight back, so he's trying to eliminate my resources before I can mount an offensive. She had changed out of her golden anniversary gown into jeans and a crisp white shirt, her hair pulled back in a ponytail that made her look younger and infinitely more dangerous. The transformation from grieving wife to strategic warrior had taken less than 4 hours, and Mirelan was watching it happen with a mixture of awe and growing concern. How can you be so calm about this? The man destroyed your life tonight. No, Taraji said, finally looking up from her papers. He revealed his true nature tonight. There's a difference. The distinction was important, though not for the reasons Mirelan understood. For 2.5 years, Taraji had been living in full knowledge of Wesley's systematic fraud, his secret family, his plan to steal her company. Tonight's revelation wasn't the discovery of betrayal. It was the carefully orchestrated beginning of his destruction. I've been thinking about our first encounter, she continued, spreading corporate documents across the kitchen island with practiced efficiency. The charity gala, the way he approached me about my textile innovations. What are the odds that a tech billionaire would have such detailed knowledge about fabric engineering that he could discuss it intelligently with a designer? Mirelan frowned. You think he researched you beforehand? I think he targeted me. Look at this timeline. He and Zirelia reconnected 7.75 years ago, just 2 months after he met me. Arisha was conceived just months later. He was already planning to support them financially when he decided to pursue the brilliant designer whose revolutionary silk blends were starting to attract industry attention. The pieces were clicking together with sickening clarity for Mirelan, though of course Taraji had understood the full scope of Wesley's manipulation for over 2 years. That bastard, Mirelan breathed. He seduced you to steal your company. He tried to succeed too, and he would have if I hadn't figured it out. Taraji's smile was sharp as a blade. But I did figure it out, Mirelan. I figured it out 2.5 years ago, and I've been planning his destruction ever since. The confession hung in the air like a bomb. Mirelan stared at her friend, processing the implications of what she had just heard. You've known for 2.5 years? 2 years, 6 months, and 16 days, to be precise. I discovered the shell companies, the systematic stock acquisition, and his relationship with Zirelia when I hired a private investigator to look into some suspicious financial transfers. And you said nothing? You let him continue stealing from you? I let him think he was stealing from me while I systematically documented every transaction, every lie, every breach of fiduciary duty. Do you know how much evidence I've accumulated? Enough to send him to prison for 20 years and recover every penny he's stolen, plus punitive damages. Mirelan was staring at her as if seeing her for the first time. You've been playing him. I've been destroying him, methodically, comprehensively, and completely. Wesley taught me to think strategically, to plan 10 moves ahead, to never reveal your true intentions until you're ready to strike. Tonight was my opening move. A soft chime from the elevator interrupted their conversation. Taraji checked her watch, 3:30 in the morning, right on schedule. The elevator doors opened to reveal Zirelia, looking haggard and desperate, her designer dress wrinkled and her makeup smeared. She stepped into the penthouse hesitantly, exactly as Taraji had known she would. I know you probably don't want to see me, she began, her voice shaky, but I had to come. I had to try to explain. Explain what? Taraji asked, her tone perfectly calibrated between pain and growing anger. How you've been sleeping with my husband for 7.75 years. How you let me plan your birthday parties and buy Christmas presents for your daughter while you both laughed about what a fool I was. It wasn't like that, Zirelia cried, right on cue. I never laughed about you. I hated what we were doing. I hated lying to you every single day. But you did it anyway. Because I loved him. I've loved Wesley since college, since before either of us knew you existed. When he found me again 7.75 years ago, just 2 months after his initial meeting with you, he called me, said he'd made a terrible mistake, that he'd never stopped loving me, that he wanted to try again. Taraji nodded slowly, as if processing this information for the first time, rather than having known it for 2.5 years. College? You knew Wesley in college? We dated for 2 years at Columbia. He was going to propose, but then his father threatened to cut him off financially if he married someone who wasn't from the right kind of family, someone who wasn't white, wealthy, and socially acceptable. The picture was becoming clearer and more disgusting with each revelation, though of course Taraji had known this entire history for over 2 years, so he dumped you to preserve his inheritance. He said it was temporary, that he would make his fortune and then come back for me. I believed him for years, waiting for him to keep his promise. Then I heard he'd married Cassandra Whitmore, and I realized I'd been fooling myself. Zerelia wiped her eyes, leaving streaks of mascara on her cheeks. I tried to move on. I had other relationships, but none of them felt real. Then 7.75 years ago, just 2 months after his initial meeting with you, he called me, said he'd made a terrible mistake, that he'd never stopped loving me, that he wanted to try again. But by then he was already pursuing other opportunities, Miralan interjected, still processing the scope of the deception. I got pregnant almost immediately, Zerelia whispered. Wesley said he was thrilled that we could finally be the family we were meant to be. But then he was also developing his relationship with you. And suddenly his plans became more complicated, Taraji said bitterly, though internally she was impressed by how well she could deliver these lines after 2.5 years of practice. He said your company had potential, that a strategic partnership could be mutually beneficial. He promised me it was just business, that once he'd secured the investment returns, he would leave you and we could be together openly. The manipulation was breathtaking in its scope. Wesley had convinced Zerelia that his marriage to Taraji was just an extended business deal, while convincing Taraji that his investment in her company was motivated by love and support for her dreams. You believed him, Taraji said. I wanted to believe him, and he was so convincing. He showed me the corporate structures, explained how he was slowly gaining control of your company. He said once he owned the majority stake, he could dissolve the marriage, claim the business, and finally give Arisha the legitimate family she deserved, while destroying me in the process. Zerelia's face crumpled. I told myself you would be fine. You're so talented, so strong. I convinced myself you would bounce back and build something even better. I know how horrible that sounds, but I was desperate to believe we could have a happy ending. At my expense. I'm sorry. I'm so incredibly sorry. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I need you to know that I never stopped caring about you. Every day I hated myself for what we were doing to you. Taraji studied her former friend's tear-stained face, searching for any sign of deception. What she saw was genuine remorse, devastating guilt, and the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that came from carrying unbearable secrets for too long. Of course, she had known about Zerelia's guilt for over a year, ever since she had started secretly recording their conversations and documenting her growing desperation to escape Wesley's manipulation. Zerelia, she said carefully, I need you to tell me everything. Every detail about Wesley's plans, his business arrangements, his timeline for taking control of my company. If you want any hope of redemption, if you want to protect your daughter from the consequences of what he's done, you need to help me fight back. He'll destroy me if he finds out I betrayed him. He's going to destroy you anyway, Mirellan pointed out bluntly. The scandal is already out there. By tomorrow morning, every society page and business publication in the country will be running stories about Manhattan's most eligible billionaire and his secret family. Your name and face will be everywhere. But if you help us, Taraji added, If you provide evidence of his fraud and manipulation, maybe we can minimize the damage to you and Arisha. Maybe we can even find a way to make him pay for what he's done to all of us." Zirelia was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing her options. Finally, she nodded slowly, exactly as Taraji had known she would. "What do you need to know?" "Everything," Taraji said grimly. "Every lie, every document, every promise he made that he never intended to keep." As the first light of dawn began to filter through the penthouse windows, 3 women sat around the marble island, surrounded by evidence of a conspiracy that had lasted 5 years. But for the first time since her world had appeared to collapse, Taraji felt something stirring in her chest that wasn't grief or rage. It was the cold, calculated satisfaction of a woman who had spent 2.5 years building an unassailable case against the man who had tried to destroy her. Wesley Hemsworth had made the mistake of teaching her how to be ruthless. Now he was going to pay the price for being such an excellent teacher. Chapter 8. The Chess Game. The morning light streaming through the windows of Miriam's downtown loft revealed 3 women who looked like they had survived a war, which, Taraji reflected grimly as she studied the evidence spread across every available surface, was essentially what had happened, though only she knew that it was a war she had been strategically planning for over 2.5 years. She had moved out of the penthouse at dawn, taking only her personal belongings and leaving behind 5 years of carefully curated perfection that now felt like the set of an elaborate stage play. Wesley's attempts to freeze her assets had been partially successful, but he had forgotten that Taraji Lathan had been resourceful long before she became Taraji Lathan Hemsworth. "The offshore accounts are still accessible," she reported, closing her laptop after completing a series of encrypted transactions. "He never knew about the emergency funds I kept in the Cayman Islands, old habits from my struggling designer days." "How much?" Mirellen asked, looking up from the legal documents she'd been reviewing. "Enough to wage war." Taraji's smile was sharp as a blade. "Wesley taught me to be paranoid about financial security. I just never told him exactly how paranoid I'd become." What she didn't mention was that those offshore accounts contained far more than emergency funds. For the past 2.5 years, she had been systematically moving money out of their joint accounts and into untraceable investments, building a war chest specifically designed to finance Wesley's destruction. Zirelia sat in the corner, looking pale and exhausted, but determined. She had spent the night providing a detailed timeline of Wesley's manipulation, complete with copies of documents he had carelessly left in her apartment and recordings of conversations she had made on her phone during their more volatile arguments. "He never suspected I was documenting anything," she said quietly. "He was so confident in his control over both of us that he got sloppy." The evidence was damning, though of course Taraji had been collecting similar documentation for much longer. Wesley's plan had been methodical and sophisticated. Identify a talented entrepreneur with revolutionary products, initiate a romantic relationship to gain access to her business, invest money with carefully hidden strings attached, slowly acquire controlling interest through shell companies, then dissolve the marriage while retaining control of the company and its innovations. "He's done this before," Taraji said, studying financial records that James Morrison had provided during their secret collaboration over the past 18 months. 3 times, actually. Always brilliant women with innovative businesses, always the same pattern of romantic pursuit followed by systematic financial acquisition. "What happened to the others?" Mirellen asked. "One suicide, one moved to Europe and never spoke publicly about it. One is currently fighting him in litigation that's been dragging on for 4 years. Taraji's voice was coldly furious, though internally she was satisfied that her research had been so thorough. "Jesus Christ," Mirellen breathed. "Wesley Hemsworth is a serial predator who targets successful women and destroys their lives for profit." "Was," Taraji corrected. "Past tense. because this time he chose the wrong target. Her phone buzzed with an incoming call from a number she recognized. Antonio Vanetti, the Italian fashion house owner whose European distribution deal had been the cornerstone of her defensive strategy. "Mrs. Hemsworth," his melodious accent was carefully neutral. "I trust you are managing well considering the circumstances." "I've been better, Antonio. I assume you're calling about our contract." "Indeed, I must confess the revelations about your personal situation have created some concern among my board members. They are questioning whether Lathan Luxury will remain stable enough to fulfill our agreement." Taraji felt a flash of satisfaction. Wesley was already working to undermine her business relationships, exactly as she had anticipated when she had structured the European deals through separate corporate entities specifically designed to be immune from his manipulation. "Antonio," she said carefully, "what would it take for your board to feel confident in moving forward with our partnership? Perhaps a meeting? Something to demonstrate that Lathan Luxury remains under competent leadership, regardless of any personal difficulties you may be experiencing." "I'll be in Milan by Thursday," she said, making the decision that she had actually planned 6 months ago. "I'll bring samples of our new European line and documentation that will satisfy any concerns about corporate stability." After ending the call, she turned to find Mirellan and Zirelia staring at her. "Are you insane?" Mirellan asked. "You can't leave the country right now. Wesley will use your absence to consolidate his position, maybe even claim you've abandoned your business responsibilities." "Let him try. I'm not running away. I'm executing the next phase of my strategy." She moved to her laptop, pulling up flight schedules and hotel reservations that she had booked months ago under an assumed name. "Wesley thinks he can destroy my reputation and steal my company while I cower in hiding. Instead, I'm going to do what I do best. I'm going to sell fashion to people who appreciate excellence. But the legal proceedings will continue whether I'm in Manhattan or Milan. James can handle the initial filings, and we'll coordinate everything remotely. Meanwhile, I'll be securing the international contracts that represent Lathan Luxury's real future." It was a strategy she had been developing for over a year, recognizing that Wesley's focus on domestic assets made him vulnerable to international maneuvering. "There's something else," Zirelia said hesitantly. "Something I haven't told you yet." Taraji looked up from her laptop, though she suspected she knew what was coming. "Wesley has been meeting with competitors, specifically with Marcus Chen at Silk Dynasty. I saw them together 3 times last month, and it wasn't social." Marcus Chen was the CEO of Silk Dynasty, Lathan Luxury's primary rival in the high-end textile market. If Wesley was collaborating with him, it could only mean one thing. He was planning to sell Taraji's innovations to her competition once he gained complete control of the company. "Do you have proof?" "Photos. I was curious about his mysterious lunch meetings, so I followed him once. I have pictures of them exchanging documents." The betrayal kept getting deeper, exactly as Taraji had expected when she had hired private investigators to document Wesley's activities 18 months ago. "Send me everything," Taraji said grimly. "Photos, documents, recordings, anything that can establish a pattern of fraud and corporate espionage." As Zirelia began transferring files to a secure cloud account, Taraji's phone rang again. This time it was Margaret Ashworth, society's most influential gossip and opinion maker. "My dear," the elderly woman's voice was sharp with interest. "I hope you're planning to fight back against that awful man." "Why, Mrs. Ashworth?" "Because I've seen his type before, and they never stop unless someone stops them. Besides, I've always preferred you to him. You have more character and considerably better taste." The endorsement from Manhattan's unofficial social queen was worth more than a dozen positive business reviews, and Taraji had been cultivating Margaret's support for over 6 months through carefully orchestrated social interactions. "I would be honored by your support," Taraji said carefully. "You have it completely." And I want you to know that several of us, the women Wesley charmed at various social functions over the years, have been comparing notes. We've identified at least 6 others he pursued before settling on you. Other business targets? Precisely. He has a very specific type. Brilliant, successful, beautiful women with companies he wants to acquire. We're prepared to testify about his pattern of predatory behavior if it becomes necessary. By the time Taraji hung up, she was smiling for the first time since the anniversary disaster. Wesley had spent years building a network of influential connections, but he had forgotten that those same connections included the women he had investigated as potential targets. "What's happening?" Mirellen asked, noting her expression. "I'm remembering something my mother used to say, if you want to destroy a man, let him think he's already won." She closed her laptop and stood, energy coursing through her veins like electricity. "Wesley thinks he's checkmated me. He's frozen my assets, undermined my business relationships, and damaged my reputation. In his mind, I'm finished. Aren't you? Not even close. See, Wesley made one crucial mistake in his grand strategy." "What's that?" Taraji's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "He taught me exactly how to destroy someone completely, and unlike him, I've been planning this war for 2.5 years instead of improvising my revenge." As she began making calls to airlines and international contacts, Taraji felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that came with executing a long-term strategy. Wesley had tried to make her a victim, but he had forgotten that she was also an entrepreneur who had built an empire from nothing once already. Now she was going to show him what happened when you declared war on someone who had been preparing for battle far longer than you realized, and who had learned your tactics well enough to use them against you with devastating effectiveness. Chapter 9. The Reckoning. The Milan courthouse had never seen a more elegant woman facing corporate fraud charges than Taraji Lathan, as she emerged from her limousine on a crisp October morning, 6 months after her world had appeared to explode at what should have been a perfect anniversary celebration. She wore one of her own designs, a navy silk suit that managed to be both authoritative and devastatingly beautiful, paired with the emerald necklace Wesley had given her for their anniversary. Let him remember what he had lost when he saw the news coverage. Let him remember what she looked like when she was destroying him. "Mrs. Lathan!" Antonio Vanetti appeared at her elbow, impeccably dressed as always but looking nervous about the media circus surrounding the courthouse. "Are you certain you want to proceed with this strategy? The exposure could be damaging to all our business interests." "Antonio," she said calmly, adjusting her portfolio as photographers snapped pictures from behind security barriers, "do you trust me?" "Implicitly. Your work speaks for itself." "Then trust me now. By the end of today, Wesley Hemsworth will no longer be a threat to anyone." The past 6 months had been a whirlwind of strategic maneuvering that would have impressed Machiavelli himself. While Wesley had been focused on domestic legal proceedings, trying to solidify his control over Lathan luxury and contain the scandal of his secret family, Taraji had been building a European empire that existed completely outside his reach. The Vanetti deal had not only survived but expanded. Working 18-hour days from her temporary headquarters in Milan, she had negotiated contracts with fashion houses in Paris, Milan, London and Barcelona that were collectively worth over $800 million, deals she had been strategically developing for over 2 years as part of her defensive plan. More importantly, she had structured these deals through a new corporate entity, Lathan Global, that was incorporated in Switzerland and completely independent of her American business. "The prosecution is ready, Mrs. Lathan," came the voice of Elena Rossi, the brilliant Italian attorney who had become her secret weapon in this international legal war. "Mr. Hemsworth's representatives arrived 20 minutes ago, and they look concerned." As well, they should. Unknown to Wesley, Taraji had spent the past 6 months not just building a new business empire, but gathering evidence for what would become one of the most comprehensive corporate fraud cases in international legal history. "Is everything in place?" she asked. "Everything. The Swiss banking authorities have frozen all accounts connected to the shell companies. The SEC has opened a formal investigation based on the evidence we provided, and the Italian authorities are prepared to present charges of international fraud and conspiracy." The genius of her strategy was its scope. While Wesley had been playing checkers, thinking only about controlling her American company, she had been playing chess on a global board. Every move he had made to consolidate power had actually provided more evidence of his systematic fraud. "Mrs. Lathan," a familiar voice called from across the courthouse lobby. She turned to see Marcus Chen approaching, looking decidedly uncomfortable. The CEO of Silk Dynasty had made a critical error 3 weeks ago by attempting to finalize his deal with Wesley for exclusive access to her revolutionary silk innovations. "Marcus," she said coolly, "I'm surprised to see you here. I wanted to speak with you privately before the proceedings begin. To explain how you've been negotiating to purchase stolen intellectual property, or to explain how you've been collaborating with Wesley to systematically undermine my business relationships." Marcus's face went pale. He clearly hadn't expected her to know about the full extent of his involvement in Wesley's scheme. "It's not what you think. Wesley approached me, claimed he had legitimate ownership of the innovations. I had no reason to doubt." "You had every reason to doubt," Taraji interrupted. "You knew those innovations were developed in my laboratories, by my team, using my resources. You knew Wesley had no involvement in the creative process. You chose to believe his lies because they offered you a shortcut to acquiring technology your company couldn't develop independently. Mrs. Lathan, perhaps we could discuss some form of settlement. The time for discussion ended when you decided to become an accessory to fraud, Marcus. Enjoy the proceedings." As Marcus retreated, clearly shaken, Elena appeared beside her with a satisfied expression. "The surprise witnesses have arrived," she said quietly. "All 4 of Wesley's previous victims agreed to testify about his pattern of predatory behavior. Mrs. Ashworth's testimony about his social manipulation tactics should be particularly devastating." The courtroom was packed when proceedings began, with international business journalists, fashion industry representatives, and representatives from multiple law enforcement agencies filling every available seat. This wasn't just a corporate dispute anymore. It had become a landmark case about protecting entrepreneurs from sophisticated financial predators. Wesley entered with his legal team looking confident, but Taraji noticed how his eyes found her immediately and held her gaze with something that might have been desperation. Even now, after everything he had done, part of him still believed he could charm his way out of the consequences. He was about to learn otherwise. "Your Honor," Elena began her opening statement, "this case represents something far more sinister than a simple business dispute. Over the past 5 years, Mr. Wesley Hemsworth has engaged in a sophisticated conspiracy to defraud Ms. Taraji Lathan of the fashion empire she built through her own talent, innovation, and tireless effort." She moved to the evidence table, which was covered with documents, photographs, and recordings that represented 2.5 years of meticulous investigation. "We will show that Mr. Hemsworth specifically targeted Ms. Lathan for romantic pursuit after identifying her company as a valuable acquisition target. We will prove that his investment in Lathan Luxury was structured from the beginning to allow him to eventually seize control of the company through a series of deliberately obscured legal mechanisms." Wesley's lead attorney, David Thornfield, stood to object, but Elena continued smoothly. "Furthermore, we will demonstrate that this pattern of behavior has been repeated multiple times, with Mr. Hemsworth targeting at least 4 other successful female entrepreneurs in similar schemes over the past decade." The first witness was Dr. Amanda Richardson, a biotechnology entrepreneur whose company had been acquired by Wesley through nearly identical tactics 7 years earlier. Her testimony was devastating, describing in clinical detail how Wesley had pursued her romantically, invested in her company, slowly gained control through hidden legal mechanisms, and then divorced her while retaining ownership of her life's work. "He was so charming, so supportive," she said, her voice steady but pained. "I thought I had found a partner who understood my vision. I had no idea I was being systematically manipulated and robbed." The second witness was Margaret Ashworth, whose testimony about Wesley's social maneuvering and his obvious targeting of successful women sent ripples of shock through the courtroom. Her decades of experience observing Manhattan's elite gave her words tremendous credibility, but the most damaging testimony came from an unexpected source: Erisha herself. Zerelia had provided recordings from the child's tablet, innocent videos of a 7-year-old girl playing and talking, but clearly showing Wesley in her apartment, discussing business strategies and referring to Taraji as the target rather than by name. "Daddy says we have to be quiet about our family because the target doesn't understand business yet," Erisha's innocent voice echoed through the silent courtroom. When Zerelia took the stand, her testimony was complete and devastating. She provided detailed accounts of Wesley's manipulation, his promises about dissolving his marriage once he gained control of Taraji's company, and his explicit statements about viewing the marriage as a business arrangement rather than a personal relationship. "He told me repeatedly that Taraji was too emotional to run a major corporation," Zerelia said, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "He said women like her needed strong men to make the real decisions, and that once he gained control, he would hire professional management to actually run the company while she focused on design work." By the time Taraji herself took the stand, Wesley's defense had completely collapsed. His attorneys had no effective response to the overwhelming evidence of premeditated fraud, conspiracy, and systematic deception. "Mr. Hemsworth convinced me that he loved me," she said, her voice clear and strong. "He convinced me that his investment in my company was motivated by belief in my vision and desire to support my dreams. I now understand that I was targeted specifically because of my innovations, pursued systematically to gain access to my intellectual property, and manipulated into a marriage that was designed from the beginning to transfer ownership of my life's work to him." She paused, looking directly at Wesley, who was staring at her with undisguised anguish. "He didn't just steal my company," she continued. "He stole 5 years of my life, convinced me that I had found perfect love, and used my trust as a weapon against me. The emotional damage is incalculable, but I'm here today to ensure that he never has the opportunity to do this to another woman." When the judge delivered his verdict 8 hours later, it was comprehensive and devastating. Wesley was found guilty of corporate fraud, conspiracy, breach of fiduciary duty, and racketeering. His assets were frozen, his business licenses revoked, and he faced significant prison time. More importantly for Taraji, all transfers of Lathan luxury assets were declared void, returning full control of her company to her immediately. Furthermore, the judge continued, the court awards Ms. Lathan compensatory damages in the amount of $200 million to be paid from Mr. Hemsworth's personal assets. As the courtroom erupted in chaos, with reporters rushing to file stories and photographers capturing every moment, Taraji sat quietly in her chair, feeling a profound sense of completion. Wesley was led away in handcuffs, but not before their eyes met one final time. In his expression, she saw not anger or defiance, but something that looked almost like admiration. He had taught her to be ruthless, and she had learned the lesson perfectly. As she walked out of the courthouse into the bright Milan sunshine, surrounded by her legal team and business partners, Taraji realized that this wasn't just the end of her marriage or the resolution of a legal dispute. It was the beginning of her real life, the life she would build now that she finally understood exactly how powerful she could be when she stopped pretending to be a victim and embraced her true nature as a master strategist. Chapter 10. The Second Earthquake and Ultimate Triumph. 2 years after the Milan courthouse had witnessed the complete destruction of Wesley Hemsworth's empire, Taraji Luthan stood on the terrace of her new penthouse overlooking Central Park, watching the sunrise paint Manhattan in shades of gold and possibility, knowing that in exactly 3 hours she would deliver the most shocking revelation of her entire extraordinary life. The woman who gazed out at the city bore little resemblance to the wife who had appeared to watch her perfect marriage implode at an anniversary party. This Taraji was harder, more confident, radiating the kind of power that came from rebuilding an empire from ashes and emerging stronger than ever before. Lathan Global was now worth $3 billion, making her the youngest, self-made female billionaire in fashion history. "You're nervous," observed a familiar voice from behind her. She turned to find Draviel Montenegro approaching with 2 cups of coffee, his dark eyes warm with concern, and something deeper that still made her pulse quicken after 8 months of careful courtship. At 43, the renowned architect possessed the kind of quiet strength that Wesley's flashy confidence had only pretended to be: solid, reliable, honest to his core. "Not nervous," she corrected, accepting the coffee and allowing her fingers to brush his. "Anticipating." Today was the day she would finally reveal the truth about her marriage to Wesley Hemsworth. Not the version that had played out in courtrooms and newspapers, where she was the brilliant victim who had outmaneuvered her predatory husband through sheer determination and superior strategy. Today, she would tell the real story. "Are you certain about this?" Draviel asked, settling beside her on the custom stone bench he had designed for her terrace. "You don't owe anyone explanations about your past." "I owe myself the truth," she replied, "and I owe you the truth, especially if we're going to build something real together." Their relationship had begun 18 months ago when she'd hired him to design her new headquarters building, a 50-story glass and steel monument to female entrepreneurship that would house Lathan Global's international operations. What had started as professional collaboration had evolved into something neither of them had expected: a love built on respect, honesty, and genuine partnership. "Besides," she continued with a smile that held secrets Draviel was about to learn, "I've discovered that the truth, properly revealed, can be more powerful than any lie." At 10 o'clock, the conference room at Lathan Global's headquarters was packed with the same journalists, business analysts, and former associates who had covered her legal victory 2 years earlier. But today's gathering wasn't about celebrating another business triumph or announcing a new fashion line. Today was about setting the record straight. Taraji entered the room wearing one of her signature designs, a stunning emerald silk suit that made her look like a queen holding court. She moved to the podium with the confidence of a woman who had learned to command any room, any audience, any situation. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice clear and strong, "thank you for joining me today. 2 years ago, many of you covered what you believed was the story of a brilliant woman who discovered her husband's betrayal and fought back to reclaim her stolen empire." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. This wasn't the usual corporate announcement they had expected. That story was true, as far as it went, but it wasn't the complete truth. Today, I want to share with you the real story of my marriage to Wesley Hemsworth, and reveal something that no one, not even my closest friends, has ever known. She paused, surveying the room full of expectant faces, including several of Wesley's former business associates who had rebuilt their careers after distancing themselves from his scandal. "The truth is that I discovered Wesley's pattern of targeting successful women for financial exploitation approximately 2.5 years into our marriage. 2.5 years before that anniversary party. The room erupted in shocked whispers. Elena Rossi, her former attorney, leaned forward with sudden understanding dawning in her eyes. "I want to be very clear about this," Taraji continued, her voice cutting through the noise. "I uncovered evidence of his previous victims, his systematic approach to romantic manipulation, and his long-term plan to steal my company. I knew about his relationship with Zeralia. I knew Arisha was his daughter. I knew everything." "Then why didn't you expose him immediately?" called out Sarah Chen from Business Weekly. Taraji's smile was sharp as a blade. "Because I realized that Wesley had given me an incredible opportunity. He had taught me to be ruthless, shown me how to manipulate financial structures, demonstrated the power of strategic deception. I decided to become a better student than he was a teacher." The revelation hit the room like a physical force. Cameras flashed frantically as reporters realized they were witnessing one of the most extraordinary admissions in corporate history. "For 2.5 years, I played the role of the loving, trusting wife while systematically documenting his crimes, building evidence of his fraud, and most importantly, creating a completely separate business empire that existed outside his reach." She moved to a presentation screen, displaying financial documents that showed the true scope of her preparation. While Wesley was focused on slowly acquiring shares in Lathan Luxury through his shell companies, I was establishing Lathan Global in Switzerland, securing international partnerships that he knew nothing about, and transferring my most valuable intellectual property to European subsidiaries that were completely beyond his control. "You planned the entire European expansion as a defensive strategy?" asked Antonio Vanetti, who was among the attendees. "I planned everything as a defensive strategy. The European contracts, the Swiss incorporation, even the timing of major announcements, all of it was designed to ensure that when Wesley finally revealed his true nature, I would be in a position to not just survive his attack, but to destroy him completely." Margaret Ashworth, now 87 and still sharp as a tack, laughed delightedly from her front row seat. "You magnificent creature! You let him think he was hunting you while you were actually hunting him." Exactly. Wesley's fundamental flaw was his belief that successful women were easy targets because we allegedly think with our emotions rather than our intellects. He never considered the possibility that I might be more intelligent, more strategic, and more ruthless than he was. Taraji activated another slide, showing a timeline that demonstrated the careful orchestration of her counter-strategy. "I allowed him to continue his systematic acquisition of Lathan Luxury because I knew that every fraudulent transaction would provide evidence for the eventual criminal case. I documented every conversation with Zeralia, every secret meeting, every lie he told me about his business trips." "But your emotional reaction that night," protested David Morrison from the Financial Times. "Your shock when Arisha called him daddy, that seemed completely genuine." "It was genuine," Taraji acknowledged. "I had spent 2.5 years preparing for that moment, but experiencing the public humiliation of having my husband's betrayal exposed in front of 300 guests was still devastating. The pain was real. The difference was that I was prepared for it." She paused, allowing the full implications to sink in. "I want to be clear that this doesn't diminish the real harm Wesley caused to me and his other victims. The emotional manipulation, the systematic deception, the theft of our life's work, all of that was genuine and devastating, but it also doesn't diminish the fact that I chose to turn his own weapons against him." "What about Zeralia and Arisha?" asked Elena Rossi. "Were they part of your strategy?" "Zeralia was as much a victim as I was, manipulated by Wesley's promises and lies. But once I revealed the truth to her during those early morning hours after the anniversary party, she became an invaluable ally in documenting his crimes. As for Arisha..." Taraji's expression softened for the first time during the presentation. "Arisha is the innocent victim in all of this. which is why, after Wesley's conviction, I petitioned for and received full legal custody. She's now my daughter in every way that matters, and she's thriving in an environment free from her father's toxic influence. The room fell silent as reporters processed this final revelation. Wesley Hemsworth's daughter was being raised by the woman whose life he had tried to destroy. Today, Lathan Global operates in 47 countries, employs over 30,000 people, and generates annual revenues that exceed Wesley's former empire at its peak. We've established scholarship programs for young female entrepreneurs, legal aid funds for women fighting financial fraud, and mentorship networks that span 6 continents. She moved back to the podium, her presence commanding absolute attention. I'm sharing this story today for several reasons. First, because the truth deserves to be told completely, not just partially. Second, because I want other women to understand that being targeted by a predator doesn't make you a victim. It makes you someone with the knowledge and motivation to fight back more effectively than your attacker ever imagined. And third, prompted Sarah Chen. Taraji smiled, and for the first time in the entire presentation, it was a smile of pure joy rather than strategic satisfaction. Third, because I'm getting married next month, and I want to enter this new relationship with complete honesty about who I've become and how I got here. The room erupted in surprised congratulations and shouted questions about her fiancé, but Taraji raised her hand for silence. Draviel Montenegro and I will be married in a private ceremony in Tuscany, the same location where I married Wesley 8 years ago. But this time, I'm marrying a man who knows exactly who I am, not a victim who survived betrayal, but a strategist who turned betrayal into the foundation of an empire. As she concluded the presentation and opened the floor for questions, Taraji felt a profound sense of completion. She had built something beautiful from the wreckage of Wesley's lies, had transformed his manipulation into her strength, had taken his lessons in ruthlessness and used them to create something that would outlast both of them. "Mrs. Lathan," called out Margaret Ashworth, rising slowly from her front row seat. "One final question, if I may." "Of course. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Wesley had simply been honest with you from the beginning? If he had approached you as a genuine business partner rather than a predator?" Taraji considered the question carefully, then smiled with genuine warmth. "I think I would have been successful, but I never would have become unstoppable. Wesley's betrayal didn't just teach me to be ruthless, it taught me to be fearless. He showed me that I could survive the worst possible betrayal and emerge stronger than ever. In a strange way, I owe him a debt of gratitude." She paused, her voice taking on a tone of quiet steel. "But that debt was paid in full when I destroyed him. Now every success I achieve, every woman I help, every empire I build, that's all mine." As the press conference concluded and reporters rushed to file their stories, Taraji stood at the windows overlooking Manhattan, watching the city that had witnessed both her greatest humiliation and her ultimate triumph. Draviel appeared beside her, slipping his arm around her waist with the easy affection of a man who had seen her at her most vulnerable and loved her strength rather than fearing it. "Any regrets?" he asked quietly. "Only one," she replied, leaning into his embrace. "What's that?" "I regret that it took me so long to realize that the most dangerous person in any room is someone who looks like a victim but thinks like a predator." 6 months later, Taraji Lathan Montenegro stood in the same Tuscan garden where she had once married a man who saw her as a business opportunity, exchanging vows with someone who saw her as an equal partner. 8-year-old Arisha served as flower girl, radiant in a custom dress, and finally able to call someone daddy who truly deserved the title. The ceremony was intimate, attended only by those who had stood by her during the darkest moments of her journey. Mirellen served as maid of honor, Elena Rossi and Antonio Vanetti represented her international family, and Margaret Ashworth presided over the proceedings with the authority of someone who had witnessed enough scandals to appreciate a genuine love story. As Taraji and Draviel exchanged rings, she caught sight of a newspaper headline visible on a nearby table: Hemsworth sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. Wesley's appeals had been exhausted, his enablers prosecuted, his pattern of predatory behavior finally stopped. But more importantly, the small print beneath the headline told the real story. Lathan Global announces $50 million fund for female entrepreneurs recovering from financial fraud. The girl who had once designed wedding dresses above a Korean restaurant in Queens had become the queen of a global fashion empire. But this time, she had built it on a foundation of truth, partnership, and the unshakable knowledge that she could survive anything. As the sun set over the rolling hills of Tuscany, casting everything in golden light, Taraji realized that Wesley had given her one final gift without meaning to. He had shown her that the most powerful revenge wasn't just success, it was becoming so successful that your enemy's entire existence became irrelevant. Wesley Hemsworth had tried to steal her life. Instead, he had taught her how to become unstoppable. And somewhere in the distance, as champagne toasts echoed across the vineyard and Arisha's laughter rang out like music, a new empire continued to grow, built not on deception and manipulation, but on the unshakable foundation of a woman who had learned that the ultimate victory was not just surviving betrayal, but using it to become legendary. The story that had begun with an innocent child's words at an anniversary party had ended with a woman who understood the greatest truth of all. Sometimes you have to let someone think they've destroyed you to show them what real power actually looks like. The end.